So, welcome everyone to this meeting today. I hope you're having a good Marxism. My name is Rachel Penning. I'm a member at SWP in the Harringay branch, and I'm a member of UCU as well. The meeting is mashed right by Rosa Luxemburg matters today with our speaker, Charlie Kimber, who is their editor of the Socialist Worker. So, that is it. We'll have lots of time for discussion, so thank you very much.
Thank you if you're in the room or if you're online. Two sets of introductory remarks. Who was Rosa Luxemburg? I'm conscious that some people in the room will have read huge amounts about Rosa Luxemburg, others may know very little about her. So who was Rosa Luxemburg? Rosa Luxemburg was born in 1871 in the part of what was Poland, or Congress Poland as it's known. I'm not going through the history of that. Was active in the revolutionary movement from a very young age. She represented the Polish Revolutionary Organisation at the Congress of the Second International, the gathering of revolutionary socialist organisations as they were seen, socialist, social democratic organisations. When she was just 22 years old, she was involved in the events of the Revolution of 1905, which we'll come to in a moment. She ended up in Germany, played a crucial role in the German SOP, the German Social Democratic Party, particularly in the confrontation against the reformist wing led by Edward Bernstein. She was one of the very few who opposed the First World War. From the 4th of August 1914, German social democracy has become a rotting corpse, was her famous slogan. One of very few who stood against the First World War, Vladimir Lenin, who had differences with Luxemburg, nonetheless said that she would be remembered forever for that one sentence that she had put forward. Then took part, jailed during the First World War, took part in the revolution at the end of the First World War and was murdered in the rapids of revolution of 1919 by death squads sent by the equivalent of the Labour Party. She was a giant of the revolutionary movement. And if you get one thing from this meeting, read Rosa Luxemburg's own writings. Brilliant writer, brilliant speaker, someone that we can learn a great deal from. Secondly, I want to say something about strikes. We'll talk about the mass strike and what Luxemburg said about the mass strike. I want to say why we think strikes are important. Strikes are not the only form of working class struggle. Very important to say that. Mass demonstrations, occupations, takeover of roads and so on, riots, all of these matter. You'd have to be completely useless as a revolutionary not to feel your blood quicken by the resistance of young people in France at the moment after the murder by the cops of 9/11. And, our solidarity with that is absolute. And it matters, and it's important, and it's clearly an incredibly important form of working class resistance. And there are many, many others, who is unmoved by the Black Lives Matter movement? Who doesn't think it matters that school students stop over the climate? There are many, many other forms of resistance. Strikes for us matter because they reveal the reality of society, who actually does the work, that every wheel turns, every factory produces, every train and bus moves, every item of mail is delivered due to the kind permission of the working class. That's the reality of society. We learned it during the pandemic. Who mattered in the pandemic? The hedge fund billionaires, the politicians, the bankers, none of those mattered. The people who mattered were most of the low-paid workers, most of the low-paid women workers, actually. Delivery people, supermarket workers, cleaners, NHS workers, teachers, these sorts of people. Well, who really mattered during the pandemic. And the strikes reveal that. oh my goodness, the trade unions have stopped, none of the trains move. What about those brilliant managers? Ah, they make no difference. That's a very basic point, but it's actually quite full. Secondly, strikes matter because they cut off the source of surplus value, the basis of profits. And therefore, when you strike, you hit the other side straight away. And that's why they're so discomforted by it. They don't have riots, they don't have occupations, they don't like demonstrations in the streets. Look at the repressive hardening of the Tory government and many others across the world against forms of protest, particularly environmental protesters at the moment. But nonetheless, it's strikes that really get them. Strikes are collective. You can't go on strike on your own. Well, you can. But what normally follows is the sack. And therefore, if you're going to go on strike, you have to work with the other people around you. And in the course of that, you learn about allies and enemies. You learn about who supports you and who's against you. And those who are with you will be white workers, black workers, Asian workers, women and men, gay and straight, and so on. And so on. And therefore, strikes open the possibility, not the inevitability, but the possibility of overcoming some of those divisions of racism, LGBT phobia and sexism, and so on. And because strikes are collective, and they're obviously powerful, they open the potential for running society in a different sort of way. Because if we can organise and show that we're powerful and get one over the other side, why don't we then run society? Now, none of that is inevitable. It is not true, regrettably, that, which group should I alienate myself from? If 40 housing benefit workers walk out somewhere, that it inevitably leads to the conquest of proletarian power. Lenin said every strike has the Hydra head of revolution. Yeah, but not inevitably. And we know this after the last year, don't we? Been a lot of strikes. Thank goodness, not enough, but that's another meeting. Not true that they inevitably do this. Now, the reason why I put these introductory remarks is because I want to say strikes are a central method of working class resistance, and this is what Luxemburg began to write about. So let's return to Rosa Luxemburg, who's in Poland, who is faced with a problem, and the problem goes like this. She's been engaged in a polemic, an argument, with the leaders of the German Social Democratic Party. The German Social Democratic Party, which was regarded as the most important socialist party in the world. It drew its lineage directly from Marx and Engels, claimed to at least. It included incredibly important theoreticians, Karkowski, Wilhelm Liebknecht, August Bebel, and so on. And despite being illegal, there were laws against being a socialist in Germany at the time, had got more and more votes. More and more votes. 20%, 24% in the 1890s. By 1914, it would have 1 million members. By 1914, it would have 90 daily newspapers. Imagine that. A party with 90 daily newspapers. And its record of the conference, when they met in conference, and they wrote it up afterwards, used to sell 50,000 copies. That's how interested people were in and its cultural life covered everything. You could go to a socialist SDP nursery, you could have your boots cobbled by a SPD cobbler, you could go on a cycle club or whatever. The whole of life was contained. Now, a section of the SDP therefore says, right, we don't need this revolutionary stuff anymore. Let's be honest about it. You see, what had happened, I've got time to go through it, throughout the 19th century, the generally low level of class struggle of a revolutionary nature, apart from 1871, the Paris Commune. But nonetheless, from 1848, you can see that the level of revolutionary struggle was generally quite low for a period. And because of this, a growth had happened of what was called a maximum and minimum programme inside the socialist movement. The maximum programme was, at some point, we will get into the promised land and achieve socialism. But meanwhile, there is much to be done, comrades. Improving wages, getting more rights for workers, maybe making women's lives a bit better, and so on and so on. These sorts of demands put forward. And in practice, these parties eventually said, overtly, openly, why do we go on about all this revolutionary business? Capitalism is expanding, it's getting better, the surplus is there, we will get into Parliament, we'll distribute the surplus to the interest of the working class, and therefore the bit about revolution is unnecessary. Everything can be achieved within the present system. Now, Luxemburg took them on. Luxemburg said, no, people who think that they are putting forward a different route to socialism are actually putting forward a different end point. She said, I've never thought of that brilliant an analogy, but anyway, she said it's a bit like at a buffet choosing between hot and cold sausages. It's not like that, she said. It's not like that, if you've never had that choice. But anyway, and therefore, what you're actually doing is choosing two different meals, I suppose, to continue the analogy. What you're actually doing is choosing a different end. This reformist road doesn't lead to socialism. Socialism can come about only through the actions of workers themselves. Workers must conquer power through revolutionary means against the capitalist state. And she brilliantly polemicized. One of the books here, that one, Reform or Revolution, is where she takes on this argument. Well worth reading. But there was a problem. To what could she point where this was going to come about? Okay, I have a lovely vision of revolution. But where's the revolution? Show me. Show me. Quite difficult. She couldn't say the Russian Revolution hadn't happened. And therefore, when the 1905 revolution happened, she was delighted. Partly because it was a revolution, but because it filled this gap. Okay, now we understand. Here's the model by which it's possible to change society. What was the 1905 revolution? It was a 2-year period, 2.5 years really, which begins in Russia on the 20th, well, it doesn't begin. Its trigger point is said to be the 22nd of January 1905 in Petersburg, where a priest, Father Gapon, led a group of workers to make a humble petition to the Tsar, the king, the Tsar. And they were shot down, leading to a mass wave of strikes across Russia. It actually begins early in that, December 1904, with a big wave of strikes of 382 factories in St. Petersburg. And that's why they went to see the Tsar. They didn't just say, well, let's go see the Tsar. Okay. It's because they were on strike. So it begins a bit early in that. Anyway, it leads to this mass wave of resistance and the creation in October of 1905 of the Workers' Council, the Soviet, the first real appearance of the Workers' Council in history. They elect people who come together to decide how to run society because workers are fighting, you need to organise food, other things, and therefore the workers must begin to rule. Not through Parliament, a much richer form of democracy. And it emerges now in this revolution. And then, as the revolution spread, Peasantry starts with urban workers, it involves peasants, it involves the question of national rights, eventually is crushed. But along the way, learn all these lessons. And this is what Luxemburg writes about in the mass strike. And there's a new edition of it out here, which, again, I urge you very, very strongly to read. When I quote from it, I'll be using a rather older edition, which I apologise to bookmarks for. But, in the interests of reuse and recycle, I'm not going to throw this one away. I was rather abashed to find it's actually 37 years old, but there we are, it just makes me feel a bit old. Anyway, so what was Luxemburg's argument after this interesting opening remark? What was Luxemburg's argument? She said that what the mass strike demonstrated was a breakdown of the normal distinction between politics and economics. If you're in the Social Democrats or the Labour Party, politics and economics are rigidly separated. Politics is elections, which is done by politicians. Economics is about trade unions, which is done by the trade union movement. Luxemburg said, no, what we see here is the coming together of politics and economics. Political and economic strikes. General strikes of individual branches of industry and general strikes in individual towns. Peaceful wage struggles and street massacres. Barricade fighting. All these run through one another, run side by side, cross one another, flow in and over one another. It's a ceaselessly moving, changing sea of phenomena. It's a beautiful picture that Luxemburg puts forward, this idea that what happens is the interpenetration of politics and economics. Not just a political strike, it may begin as a political strike, but then, what Luxemburg called, it leaves behind a fructifying wave, a fertilizing wave, which leads to, out of which spring economic struggles. So you begin with saying, down with the Tsar, down with the king. And then you say, and by the way, we want another 20% on the wages. And then because you raise the question of 20% of the wages, you have to fight the soldiers or the police. Because you fight the soldiers and the police, that economic struggle leads on to another wave of political struggle. This is what's exciting for Luxemburg. And I'll come to it in a bit, but in every great revolution, in every great mass strike, you see this process can begin. And I'll make a lot of conditionals, because maybe I should just reveal this at the beginning. Luxemburg speaks as though this is an inevitability, all these positive things about the mass strike. And it's brilliant what she writes about it, and what she writes is true about 1905 to 1907. And it's true about quite a lot of mass strikes. But it's also not true about quite a lot of mass strikes. Mass strikes can be constrained, cramped, restricted by the actions of trade union leaders and by people like the Labour Party leadership. They can sometimes be forced to call very, very big strikes, but which you don't get that sense of politics and economics coming together, of all the other features which Luxemburg will talk about. I mean, you think about Britain in the last year. There has been twice 500,000 people on strike on the same day. That was great, really refreshing, it's incredibly important. Not true that you have this virtuous cycle of politics, economics, inevitably leading to the next wave of struggle and so on. Certainly, this may be news to some of you, has not led to the struggle for proletarian power in Britain, as yet. Let's see if we're there by the end of Marxism. But anyway, you get the point. So Luxemburg is talking about what happened during this period, but we'll see otherwise why sometimes it doesn't happen in that way. Now, it's also important that, I was going to talk more about that, and I thought, no, this is too complicated. Luxemburg said that one of the key things was mass strikes can't be prepared to order. You can't say, in 3 weeks we'll have a strike of 1 million people, and let's just prepare for it. And you can't do it until you've got everyone in line. We'll get everyone in line, and then we'll go over the top with a mass strike. This was actually an argument with the anarchists, because one of the things Bakunin and Engels had a big argument about this in the 1870s, about whether the way forward was to get everything in line and then go over the top. Thank you, Con. She said, no, you can't do it like that. I mean, Luxemburg had clearly been reading Jane McAlevey in some senses. Jane McAlevey is a theorist who says that you can't really have a big strike till you get 90% of people in the union and all the rest of it. She said you can't do it like that. You can't, it's not, it arises from the working class, from the realities of struggle, from the realities of economic situations. And Luxemburg says that general strike, which used to be this concept put forward by the anarchists that we'll all get in line and never go and fight, has now changed sides. She says, far from the general strike being, the mass strike being the slogan of the anarchists, it has now become the historical liquidation of anarchism. It's quite hard on the anarchists. Which she described as the ideological sounding board of the counter-revolutionary lumpen proletariat, which, you know, is quite a tough version of what anarchism is about. But she said now it's part of the repertoire of revolutionary socialism. The mass strike is now central to what our argument will be about. Okay, what did she say were the features? The unorganised become organised. That those who've never been in a union, those who've never seen themselves as organised workers, suddenly become organised. If you look at any great mass strike, you can see this process at work. People who haven't seen themselves as part of the labour movement or whatever, suddenly become involved. Here's Luxemburg writing about it. This is a gigantic, many-coloured picture of a general arrangement of labour and capital, which reflects all the complexity of social organisation and the political consciousness of every section and of every district. And the whole long scale runs from the regular trade union struggle of a picked and tested troop of the proletariat drawn from large-scale industry to the formless protest of a handful of rural proletarians, and to the first slight stirrings of an agitated military garrison, from the well-educated and elegant revolt in cuffs and white collars in the counting house of a bank, to the shy, bold murmurings of a clumsy meeting of dissatisfied policemen in a smoke-grimed, dark and dirty guardroom. One sentence though, she really did need to learn about the full stop. But anyway, you get the picture. Here, every layer of the working class, and it begins to split the stage as well. Luxemburg didn't think the cops were the crucial element. What she said was, get this big strike, involves everybody. And then it begins to split the stage. Secondly, everything happens at a great pace. Speeds up development. Thirdly, it creates organisation. That people who've never been involved in political parties or discussion clubs or campaigns or trade unions suddenly begin to organise themselves. Think of what comrades will speak about examples, but you can see how that process begins as well. The level of the working class culturally is pitched forward. People don't just say, I want £15 an hour minimum wage. They also begin to talk about how they want to live a different sort of life. And you see this, I mean, you know, what happened in France between January and June is only a glimpse of the sorts of things that Luxemburg talked about. But think about what happened in France. People begin a struggle about pensions, but then it becomes, what sort of democracy do we live in? That Macron can push through these attacks without even winning a majority in Parliament. What? Look at how the cops act. the cops, they deny us democracy, and then they smash us off the streets when we try and do something. But people begin to raise the question of women's rights, because they're affected more by the attacks on pensions, but then a whole number of questions about the role of women. The question of racism and anti-racism, Islamophobia begins to be raised within the movement. So that, as one person put it to me, I realised that the people taking away my pensions were Macron and his allies, it wasn't Muslims. Which is a very basic understanding. But it's true. You know, people begin to raise these sorts of questions, which is, as Luxemburg, she didn't come up with the phrase, but it's the idea of the festival of the oppressed. The festival of the oppressed. And, you know, what's brilliant about the mass strike is it goes through the economic, the political, the way in which they flow together, about the way in which you get this new possibility of transformation. Right. But, and there is a big but, is a big but because it's not true that every mass strike is like this. You think about the general strike in Britain in 1926. It doesn't show this. It doesn't. There are things that there's a hidden history of the general strike, which doesn't go through. Thank you, Con. Which doesn't go through everything that's fantastic about it, right? That it was all boring and everyone played football with the cops all the time. So actually, it was much more violent than that in many places. It's much more interesting than that in many places. Nonetheless, the trade union bureaucracy retained control. And again this happens. Often in the modern world, mass strikes are those constrained by the Labour Party leaders and the trade union leaders. This is very, very important, because it suggests that what we need to do is not simply to say, fantastic, here's a mass strike, but you also have to think of the overcoming of the trade union leaders. Now, it's often said that Luxemburg thought all of this would happen spontaneously, and there is an element of truth to that. I mean, Luxemburg she's very, very fond of meteorological metaphors. That the mass strike comes about like a lightning bolt, like a lightning flash, like ball lightning, like zigzag lighting, like an electric shock, like a storm, like a hurricane, like a thunderstorm, like wildfire. You get the impression. I'm not actually completely sold on this, because it suggests it's a bit like the weather. It's a bit impersonal, but nonetheless, you get the idea, right? Now, people sometimes say, oh, the trouble was she was completely spontaneous, or she thought these things happen spontaneously. Yeah, but when you look at her actual practice, she was actually really into the building of organisation in Poland. In Poland, she was a hard party builder. I mean, people think Rosa Luxemburg, oh, she was lovely, wasn't she? She was just a really nice woman, unlike that horrible Lenin. Lenin, he was nasty. Rosa Luxemburg, she was lovely. In the faction fights in the Polish movement, she was utterly brutal. I mean, I have to tell you, it's not a great thing, and it's wrong, that she used to occasionally reveal who were the real people behind the assumed names of her opponents, so that the cops would arrest them. I mean, that's really not great, you know. But the idea that she was, you know, this lovely person who never fought in the party faction is complete nonsense. So she was very into, you know, organisation. The thing was, she didn't want to emphasise the party to that extent in Germany. And she didn't want to emphasise it in Germany because she knew that the party she was talking about was the reformists, who would crush the movement. And therefore, she completely underplays it. She gives the impression that all of this will be done in the course of struggle. So, she writes that it's high time for the working masses of social democracy to learn how to express their capacity for decision and action, and therewith to demonstrate their rightness for the time of great struggles and great tasks, in which they, the masses, will be actual chorus and the directing bodies will merely act as speaking parts. That is, they will only be interpreters of the will of the masses. And again, if once the ball is set rolling, then social democracy, whether it wills it or not, can never again bring it to a standstill. But the trouble is, we know that's not true. Again and again, the trade union leaders and the Labour Party type leaders, far from being unable to bring it to a standstill, are very able to bring it to a standstill. Look at what happens in Greece after 2015. Syriza is elected on the basis of 32 general strikes. It's inconceivable that Syriza would have been elected without the 32 general strikes, and therefore in part are an expression of that movement. What does Syriza do? It immediately stops those strikes and concedes compromises and gives in to the people who want to do a deal with the bankers and the European Union and so on. So Luxemburg doesn't address that problem, and this is a wider problem with Luxemburg, which is that she remained inside the equivalent of the Labour Party almost up to the end of her life. Despite the First World War, despite the fact that it had adopted this reformist practice, despite the fact that she was she could see what was happening, she didn't form an independent revolutionary organisation. And therefore you have to realise how brilliant the mass strike is. And at the same time you have to say there's a key missing element, two key missing elements. One is the struggle against the trade union bureaucracy. The other is the question of independent revolutionary socialist organisation. And when you look at Rosa Luxemburg's life, this sounds a bit tough, but I'm going to say it. She paid for those failures with her life. The reality was that when revolution happened in 1980, there was not an independent revolutionary organisation which could help workers to learn, which could develop the workers' councils that existed, which could manoeuvre and had deep roots inside the working class. It didn't have it. And therefore it was hurled about by events that revolutionary workers who were rising in huge numbers did not have an organisation which could carry out the same role as the Bolsheviks did in 1917 in Russia. And she paid for it with her life. And in some senses, the failure of the German Revolution to happen was then why the Russian Revolution was overcome, was defeated eventually by 1928, and why we're living in a capitalist world today. Now, I'm not blaming Rosa Luxemburg for all that, right? But we do have the luxury to learn from her brilliance, but also to learn from her failures. And this is why it massively repays reading Rosa Luxemburg and thinking about what her political heritage is. It's a heritage brilliantly against the war. I mean, it took real courage to stand up against the war. It took real courage as a really young woman to actually stand up in a huge conference at this mass party, the most important party in the whole world, and say, all those greybeards on the top table are wrong. You need to stick to revolutionary politics, not go along with all those famous theoreticians, and to back it up, not just as a slogan, but with brilliant analysis and learning from Marxism. She was courageous, she was deeply theoretical, she was a brilliant fighter, but we could also learn that we need to go beyond her analysis as it's put forward, take on the trade union bureaucracy, and build independent revolutionary organisation. Thank you.
Okay, so before we bring in speakers, could you turn to the person next to you, have a quick discussion, 2-3 minutes about the ideas, what was being raised in that meeting?
Thank you, Comrade. I wanted to say something about, I'm a PCS activist in Manchester, and I was recently, until recently, I was on the National Executive Committee, and they do not require my services anymore. And I wanted to say something about strikes as a living political school, because obviously what we have gone through recently is nowhere near a mass strike, as I understand it. But the PCS experience has been, we're government workers, we're civil servants. After a decade of cuts, we had huge enthusiasm for our ballot, first of all, in autumn last year. Highest turnout in our union's history, thousands of people joining, biggest and youngest picket lines we've ever had in our history, and that includes, so bigger and younger than 2011, when hundreds of people were out, 250,000, I think, were out in that over pensions. Many of these people have never been on strike. We have big rallies, we have marches, and we have the trade union bureaucracy doing everything they possibly can to undermine us. They're pessimistic. They believe members can't afford to vote, to strike. They have held us back by only allowing us 3 individual days of national strikes. We've had what they call targeted and sustained, where they paid people. And these are not bad people. They are some very, very good, hard, anti-racist campaigners. You know, they are not the enemy in some ways, but they have absolutely undermined us at every turn. And because they want to negotiate a deal, but the government won't talk to them. They want to protect the union as well. They want to protect our property, protect members' money. They never stop talking about that. So the question is, what do we do to overturn those bureaucracies and challenge their inertia and pessimism? And the meeting this morning before lunch with all the people who were on strike, talking about the networks we need to build to actually, how do we get coordinated action? We clearly have to organise from the bottom up. The Workers' Summit in September is an incredibly important opportunity for us. It's slogan that live the fight, reject bad deals, fight to win. And it has to be said that my pay rise this year at around 5% will be more than I got 5.6% last year, basically because we won the ballot. I'm relatively low paid, so I got more than the 2% we were supposed to get. And I will get more this year because of it. And we've only had 3 individual days of strikes. We can win so much more. And at some point, we are going to have to break the law. And that can seem like a hell of a lot, but the anti-trade union laws are holding us back. And just a very small PCS example, our colleagues in the Home Office work on the borders. How's that for a miserable job for you? And they work in the boats, in the cutters, in the channel, and Priti Patel told them to push back migrants back into French waters. They refused to do it. They broke the law, they rescued those people, and now we have overturned the Rwanda plan. Thank you very much.
Elliot G will be after Anne Alexander.
Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, everybody. I want to reinforce the point really about the separation between politics and economics, and how politics has to be central to struggle and how they flow together. I'm in UCU, and I want to come further in a moment when I talk about the Ukraine and the politics of imperialism and war. But I remember 1984-85 miners' strike, a young revolutionary, selling papers outside the Labour Party conference at the time. And it was when Scar was on strike. He made this amazing speech to the Labour Party conference, and he talked about the struggle and the need for solidarity, and everybody got to see Scar speak. It's a fantastic speech. And at the end of the speech, he gets a standing ovation by everybody in the audience. Fantastic speech. Next day, Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party then, comes along, makes a speech. More or less opposite to what Kinnock did. He denounced his famous Fear Nor Favor speech, where he denounced the violence of the picket lines, denounced all these kinds of things and so on. He got a standing ovation as well. Now I remember at the time thinking, how the hell does that happen? Do they really want a lot of people to hear Scargill one day and then wheel them out, let some other audience in, or is there some sort of mass schizophrenia taking place inside the Labour Party? How come? No, it isn't that. You see, if you're in the Labour Party, and this is the secret why it always loses, because it accepts there's a division. The trade union struggle is for the trade unionists and the workers, whereas the political struggle is one which is election time and so on and so forth. That separation between the two means their side always wins. Their side never ever separates the political and economic struggle. Look at France. They're using everything they possibly can to defeat the working class. Not just their political arm, you know, the politicians and the like, but also their economic arm, the state, the police. They don't see a forced division of those two things. They unite those two things and beat and use them, and that's why they always lose and our side always loses. And that's why, for us as revolutionaries, a separation, when you're fighting the struggle, it's important that we don't separate the two things. If you see at the moment time, we've been witch hunted because we passed a motion at UCU Congress which called for three things. Number one, Russian troops out. 1 minute, that, yeah. Well, Russian troops out, excellent. Calls to NATO, also out, but also this is government not to give arms to to Ukraine. It created a bit of a storm, to say the least. We've got attacked inside and outside of the by the left, by the way, not just the right wing, by the left, who didn't agree with this position. But one of the main arguments that came with this was, it's a diversion. It's a diversion from from trade unionism. It's a diversion, this argument about Ukraine, from the action inside the higher education dispute. It's a diversion from this. And far can it be from the truth. When I think from my experience in UCL, I look at Brighton, for example. Brighton University is going for all-out indefinite strike action, one of the most organised, one of the most militant sections we have inside the union. It is not a coincidence that same branch also was one of the branches we put the Ukraine motion. The politics and economics aren't separate. In fact, the most organised, the most militant sections are those who understand that. Why? Because it's about divisions. If your side can't win their workers to oppose imperialism, then when it comes to the employers, they're in a weaker situation. Especially when the employers say, we need the money from education to send over to Ukraine. What do you do about that? You have to give up the struggle. The struggle for politics and economics is not a luxury, it's a necessity, and that's why we will win if we do that, and that's why they will continue to win if we don't learn those lessons.
The next speakers come up, we have a question to be read out from Dot Pierce, and the question is, why did the revolution happen in 1905 in Russia? What were the causes? So it's Anne, then Elliot, and then it'll be Isabel Ringrose.
Thanks very much. So I want to speak a bit about the application of Rosa Luxemburg's arguments and also of the analysis that Charlie's put forward and the friendly but critical stance towards Rosa Luxemburg's arguments in relation to parts of the global economy that are outside of the core of the capitalist system, so not in the largest economies, places in the global south, for example. Because one of the things that is often sort of thrown back at revolutionaries is that if you argue that the working class is central to changing society, then that presupposes that there is a working class, or there is a working class in a form which is able to organise itself in the ways that Rosa Luxemburg was describing. And this is often not as easy to see in countries in the global south. There may be many people who are in more informal types of jobs. There may be very weak traditions of trade unionism. You may have an issue with, it seems like, the lack of trade unions, not the problem of the trade union bureaucracy. But what I want to argue is if you look at the revolutionary movements and upheavals we've seen in recent years, for example, the magnificent movement that we've seen in Sudan since 2018 is unfortunately being crushed at the moment by a counter-revolutionary war, that you can see that actually Rosa Luxemburg's arguments apply very well. That in the case of countries such as Sudan or Egypt, Tunisia or elsewhere in the global south, that the power of workers to really shape the state is still there. There is a strategic importance to what they do because, for example, if you take the role of port workers or the role of transport workers, of teachers and doctors, they may not be a majority in those societies, but they still have an enormous amount of power. But equally, the point that Charlie raised about the problems of the separation between politics and economics is also present in those countries. I'm going to give you two slightly contrasting, very brief examples. In the case of Tunisia in 2011, there was a strong trade union movement, which had a very strong trade union bureaucracy, which actually played a very contradictory role, similar to the ones that Charlie was outlining in 2011, 2012, made compromises with the state, essentially saved the state from itself. Leading, in fact, several years later to a counter-revolution and the restoration of quite an authoritarian regime because there wasn't enough of an alternative that was independent at the base of society. In the case of Egypt, the trade union bureaucracy was tied up with the regime, and there were independent unions. But in 2011, 2012, you actually also had similar problems occurring of, for example, very good trade union activists feeling that their struggle was separate. They did separate struggles in the streets as what they did in the workplaces. And this again left an opening for the generals to come through and to reassert their power. That's why the analysis that Charlie made about the importance of independent revolutionary organisation is absolutely crucial wherever you are in the global system.
And goes to Ryan.
Hi everyone, my name is Elliot. I've spent the last year working as a healthcare assistant, part of the RCN, and if you can't tell from hot pink, part of the SWP. So obviously the story of the RCN over the last year has been where you can look at it in two different ways. You've got the story of the bureaucrats, or you've got the story of the working rank and file. You've got the story of the bureaucrats, it's a woeful tale. It's a tale where we've lost. We've ended up with a miserable pay offer, being beaten around by the Tories, and nothing really to come away from it apart from a pay deal that they don't really get because no one got $1.5 grand because it's all taxed back and taken away your student loans. Now, if you look on the other side though, the story of the working rank and file, you see 100,000 nurses voting to go out on strike after a year of action. You see 100,000 nurses ready to link with doctors and organise and make a real difference, a real change. That strike battle was only lost if you play the game of the Tories. It was only lost if you trust the bureaucrats. And I spent time talking to leaders in the bureaucrat positions, and what they have to say, they've got to say incremental, incremental, incremental. They've told me we will not discuss reballoting. We will not discuss reballoting on a disaggregated ballot. Again, their story is one of defeat. You look in the WhatsApp chats, you look in the workers' chats, what do you hear? You hear, we need to reballot. We need to get more involved, and NHS workers say no. We need to get out there on the pickets and we need to make a difference. And they are ready to fight, and they will fight, because this is not going to go away. Because this crisis, these crises are not going to go away. Inflation is up, Tories' racism is up, desperation is up, and that means the working class must also rise up. That means we must link up. That means we must raise our fists up and fight back harder than we ever have before. And that will only come through systematic and effective organisation. And this is the great thing. We're seeing amazing movements in NHS workers say no. We're seeing amazing rank and file movements spring up left, right and centre. But they're not linking up enough. There are only certain groups that do, and those are the revolutionary groups. And those are the groups that are willing to offer a fundamental challenge to the system. The groups that say, we don't want Labour 2.0. It didn't work in the past, and it will not work tomorrow. There's the groups that say, we have an argument that will win, a strategy that will win, arguments that make sense, that anyone can take to a picket line and talk to the people on the picket and convince them to go out again next week, to go out again next month, and to escalate and escalate and escalate until you win. So I say, if you're not part of the SWP, please consider joining, because we need you out there now. We need you ready, because this crisis is going to escalate. And if we do not fight back harder, it's going to get a hell of a lot worse.
Thanks, Isabel, then Angus, and then Judy Sherry.
Hi, yeah, I think the question of the economic and political is such an interesting one, because it's working class people who've got the interest in bringing these two things together. And even if we did keep them separate, it's not like we can really rely on our trade union leaders to get us, the best pay deals possible, given, the deals they're putting forward at the moment. It's not like we can trust someone like Keir Starmer to uproot the roots of racism, or go out and try and put King Charles' head on a spike, like they did in Russia and Germany, if only. And I think it's important as well, because as workers, we can't separate that economic and political in our lives, can we? I can't go into work as a worker and then come back out as a woman. Those two things are absolutely interconnected, aren't they? We see those divisions put in place to keep us weaker as a way of holding back working class people. But as working class people, we know that our oppression and our exploitation are absolutely linked, and that's why we argue for that joining. But I think we have to then look further as well, can't we? Because fighting, on the picket lines or fighting in protest only has, so far it can take us. And I think that's why the question of reform versus revolution, that obviously Rosa Luxemburg goes into in such detail, is such an important one. Because do we fight in the here and now, or do we sit back and put a date for the revolution in the diary and hope that when that arises, everything's going to be better? Again, if only it was that easy. But Rosa Luxemburg said that revolutionaries actually have to be fighting hardest in the here and now for those reforms, because it's during those fights that we
gain confidence, we gain our consciousness. It's important that we fight for abortion rights. It's important that we fight for trans rights because it matters, the type of world that we want to live in now. But also it helps us see the real enemy. We see that actually we should be, fighting with trans people. We should be fighting with black people. We should be fighting together as a class. Obviously, the problem then is how far you can take that, because we can see that the reforms are being rolled back. We can see that abortion rights are being snatched back. We can see that trans rights, it's not going to be an easy battle. And that's why I think it's really exciting when we see, strikers like St Mungo's taking up the questions of racism and LGBT rights, or the Liverpool Dockers talking about Suella Braverman's border policies are absolutely disgusting. And it can seem like we're quite far away from that big general strike that's going to lead to that revolution and, happy days. But I think that's why we fight for every single struggle, we fight for every single protest, we fight for working class involvement, because we can't just sit back and put the revolution in the diary and hope for the best. We have to fight in the here and now, but we have to have a wider analysis of how we're going to keep that lasting permanent change. So I think it's really exciting after this brilliant festival to be going out and doing that, because it's totally in our capabilities.
Brilliant. I'm Angus. Interestingly, I think I probably have quite a different perspective. So I'm currently a teacher, and I'm striking on Wednesday and Friday, and as we have been for the last 4 months at this point, and it looks like we will be striking in September as well. So I'm an EU, but for us, our union and our bureaucrats have been the strongest force in the strike. They've been the ones pushing us towards the strike, often engaging with members to get us to strike. And my question was, and I think the point I'm trying to make is, we're thinking about Luxemburg's analysis of power and economics. Teachers and to some extent doctors and nurses, we have a slightly different reason for striking. There's obviously the economic side where we want better pay and we want fairer working conditions, but one of the difficulties in our striking is that we are directly confronted with the dangers of not striking. So this Wednesday, at my school, we have a Year 6 transition day, where all the Year 6s across Kingston come to our school and they're introduced as their future Year 7s. And if you ever met a primary school kid who's in Year 6, they are usually bricking it to come to secondary school, because they have heard all the terrifying stories. So as the union rep for my school, I have to convince a workforce of people who love and care for their students to actively harm their students in striking. And it's a condition of striking that isn't reflected in a lot of Marxist literature. In the doctors, nurses, teachers, many public sector workers, where you are engaging in work not simply for economics, but often for love and care, in your strike you see the effect of your strike directly in harming others. And so what I'm interested in is how would we explain that within the framework of Luxembourg's economics, Luxembourg's power, but also the message that it can lead to other unions, that many of my members who will go on strike on Wednesday at the detriment of their students make the explicit case that in the long term, our strike will gain money for our students. It will gain money for those students that we see in terrible housing, who are being victims of an unfair system. I have students who legally have access to TAs but will not get any because there's not enough funding. That doesn't seem to be an economic concern or even a power concern. It seems to be a concern of fairness and a concern of love. There's a philosopher, Paulo Freire, he's an educationalist, he talks about the revolutionary love in teaching, linking Che Guevara and linking to Fidel Castro's works. And that seems to be my area of influence in Luxembourg, that notion of care and sacrifice that public sector workers have within their striking that's not necessarily linked to power and economics. Thank you.
Yeah, rereading the mass strike, I think, after the year of strikes that we've just had has been pretty useful fuel. So even if you've read the book, I would recommend people to get the new copy and have a look back through it again in the context of the strikes. Just to go through, I think, the lessons of it that other people have talked about, political and economic flowing into each other and cross-fertilising. And you look around and think this is the biggest Marxism that we've had, in quite a few years. And I think the reason for that is that it's a reflection of the scale of the crisis, the system that we see around us. People are really being driven to look for ideas that can, suggest some way that we can change things and break beyond what they're being offered. And obviously it's a small reflection here about Marxism, but there's so many more people out inside the strike movements and beyond who have the same questions. And of course it's about, the attacks on pay, the cost of living crisis, the fact that we've all probably noticed that it's actually a lot more difficult just to get through day-to-day life as working class people. But we know as well it's about that whole question about what capitalism is doing to the price, to the environment. The fact that the birds are all leaving Britain is something that I think makes people sad. The fact that there's a crisis in mental health, Me Too. The question that you've got the far right trying to mobilise and pull things to the right, and we've got demonstrations outside hotels where people have travelled in the most horrendous conditions across the world, and to be told that they're not welcome and that government is fueling this. And I think there's all these different issues politically that are, this is what Rosa Luxemburg's talking about in action. So I think we have to be, as socialists in the movement, fusing and bringing together these things, bringing the questions of the fight against racism or for the climate into the strikes and making that part of the fight. The other question is about the role of bureaucracy, and I won't be able to read the quote, obviously, but people should also get the book and read it. But there's passages in it where, and I remember reading it as a student and thinking, this is wonderful. She has this really fierce sense of the union leaders will just be swept aside, and the masses are just going to, they'll be dealt with, and the revolution will just go forward, and so on. And I think there's an element of truth in that kind of, when people get confidence and fight back, we can push beyond poor leadership of reformist leaders or trade union bureaucracies, but actually we know ourselves that it's actually not quite as automatic, and that there has to be a fight to try and build that side, whatever the difference that you're in a revolutionary moment or whether you're in one like we're in now. We have to actually fight to try and build a side inside the movement that can counter the poor leadership that's given by the trade union leaders and the reformist pool to always try and conciliate. So we need to try and be a part of building that side, and that means politicising the strikes, getting people to the Workers' Summit, which is a beginning attempt to try and build that side inside the strike movement, to push beyond what the union leaders are doing and question that, and also the importance of revolutionary organisation to build that now for the way the struggle could open up in the future.
Comrades, when my son was at school studying history, he was asked to write about a famous woman. I can't remember exactly what the criterion was, and he wrote about Rosa Luxemburg, and his history teacher had never heard of her before. And I don't suppose that's really surprising, because they try and bury our history, don't they? And that's why it's so important that we have events like Marxism that keep that tradition alive, the working class tradition, the revolutionary tradition, not to study it like some kind of moribund fossil, but because of the way that theory interacts with practice and informs our revolutionary practice for today. And I don't think there's any event like Marxism that does that both studies the theory and talks about how it's relevant for the practice today and attempts to improve how we actually intervene in the struggles today, that provides a vehicle for all of those that are angry about glaring inequality, about institutionalised racism, about climate change, that really reject all of the evils of capitalism. And people are thirsting, I think, for something better, for how we can really fight for socialism. And that's why there are thousands of people at Marxism this weekend. That's why it's the biggest Marxism festival that we've held for over a decade. All of which is brilliant, but it does mean, comrades, extra cost. Because, for example, we've had to book extra venues. You can imagine the cost of hiring venues in central London is not cheap. I think we keep the ticket value quite low. I think it's excellent value for money in terms of what you get for the weekend, not just in terms of discussions, the debates, the entertainment, and what is provided for you. I think that's fantastic. If you possibly can, comrades, we really do need you to make an extra donation to ensure that events like Marxism, but there isn't really another event like Marxism, to ensure that the Marxism Festival continues to thrive, continues to grow, and continues to provide that facility for future revolutionaries. So there are buckets coming round now. I would urge you please to put your money in. I've got my £10 ready just to put my money where my mouth is. Cash, coins, anything you can put in. If you really don't have cash, there are card readers available that can take donations at all of the SWP stores, or ask a Marxism team member and say that you would like to make a donation to keep Marxism going. But let's ensure that brilliant events like this continue to thrive, continue to grow, and continue to attract an audience that are going to become the revolutionists that are going to make a better future for all of us. Thank you.
I'm going to come in and try and answer those questions and round up for about 10 minutes.
Well, thanks to everybody who spoke. I'll try and come back on as many as possible. Thanks to Dr. Hiss for the question about the roots of the Russian Revolution. Look, it followed 10 years of a rising wave of class struggle. You can look at the textile workers' strike of 1896, for example, about 40,000 workers, most of them women, which is one of the earliest mass big strikes in Russia, running right up till a whole layer of mass strikes in 1903, 1904. Not hundreds of thousands of workers, but big strikes by workers. And then a political act that the Russian state, partly in order to try and bring people together through nationalism, launches a war against Japan, which it then loses. And because it loses the war, it encourages everyone to think we can beat the state. And then you had this coming together of strikes and then the shooting of people in January of 1905, triggering this movement that then spreads like wildfire, as a word, sort of word that Luxemburg would like. And she says this, millions, quite suddenly and sharply, came to realise how intolerable was the social and economic existence which they patiently endured for decades in the chains of capitalism. Thereupon there began a spontaneous general shaking of and tugging of these chains. All the innumerable sufferings of the modern proletariat reminded them of the old bleeding wounds. Here was the 8-hour day fought for. There piecework was resisted. Here were brutal foremen driven off in a sack or a hand cart. At another place, infamous systems of fines were fought against. Everywhere, better wages were striven for, and here and there, the abolition of homework. And you get this, once you get the thing moving, everyone takes it up. That's the forerunners of it. The comrade who asked about the teachers and health workers and so on. Now look, first of all, we shouldn't prettify the role of education under capitalism. I'm sure teachers are concerned, many of them at least, for school students and want the best for them. But let's understand the role that education plays. It's not the liberation of the humanity of school kids. It's not about giving them the capacity to criticise the society around them. It's not about developing their all-round potential. It's about exam factories. It's about preparing them for exploitation. So let's not get, when we talk about what it will mean, let's not be defensive about it. And I know this about health workers as well. Of course health workers can't say, we're out, all of us, let the bodies pile up. That's not a way to run a health strike. And let's be clear as well, if they don't go on strike, thousands of people will die because of what's happening to the health service. Let's be clear about that. Trade union leaders are far too defensive and apologetic. Oh, nobody wants to go on strike. We'd all much rather be working. I mean, they always say this. Rubbish. Rubbish. Talk to lots of health workers. They will tell you, I can't wait to be on strike. And they're absolutely right to put forward that position. No defensiveness about this system. And we do have power. When teachers stop, for example, it means lots of parents can't go to work. That's a sort of second order power, if you like. Like when teachers stopped during the pandemic, when they stopped and said we won't open the schools, it was incredibly important because it forced the government's hands to close the schools, which was a more general question of health and safety under the pandemic. That was largely a movement, unofficially by the way, outside that of the trade union leaders. So let's be clear, no defensiveness about those sorts of questions. 2 points to finish with. One is about politics and economics. You'll hear me say this a lot, but if you go to a picket line at the moment, health workers picket line, the junior doctors when they go on strike, the RMT when they go on strike, the NEU when they go on strike, all of which are happening quite soon. It's not enough to speak about the dispute. Of course you have to talk about the dispute. Of course you do. We have ideas about how to win the dispute. You also have to talk about refugees. You have to attack it and talk about the way that they're using racism against us. Now some trade union leaders say, don't talk about racism, let's be united. Because if you talk about saying we're for the rights of refugees, you'll divide the workforce. It's not anti-racism that divides the workforce, it's racism that divides the workforce. Let's be clear about that. And racism is a knife at the throat of working class unity. And therefore, it is absolutely indispensable that you raise these sorts of questions. Look at what's happening in France now. Follow the social democratic and trade union leaders. Look at what they're saying. The leader of the Communist Party, Fabien Roussel, made a statement yesterday where he said, I have nothing to do with the violence. We must attack those who are rioting in the streets. The leader of the Communist Party is supposed to be, by the way. And he says about those who burn down police stations, he says, communists are for building up public services, not burning them down. What a disgrace! What an outrage that someone put forward that position. Be clear about that. You can't avoid the political questions that are raised in the course of the movement, which is why comrades have spoke about this. Taking up the question of war, taking up the question of trans rights, taking up the question of anti-racism is incredibly important. To finish with, at the end of her life, many of the lefts attacked Rosa Luxemburg. Oh, look where those politics got her. Dead. And they were brutal. And these were left-wingers, some of them. I mean, often there's said to be on the right of the movement, far to the left of Jeremy Corbyn. But, people like Scheidemann and Kautsky and so on attacked, Paul Levy attacked Luxemburg. And Lenin said this: we should reply to Levy and the others by quoting two lines from a good old Russian fable. Eagles may at times fly lower than hens, but hens can never rise to the height of eagles. And then he goes through a long list of things he disagrees with Luxemburg about. And then he says, since August the 4th, 1914, German social democracy has been a stinking corpse. This statement will make Rosa Luxemburg's name famous in the history of the international working class movement. And of course, in the backyard of the working class movement, among the dung heaps, hens like Levy, Scheidemann, Kautsky, and all that fraternity will cackle over the mistakes committed by this great communist. To every person their own. And Lenin, with other words, saying, of course, we think Luxemburg made mistakes, but the revolutionary core of the politics she spoke about are absolutely correct and absolutely necessary now. But we know, we'll learn from this, but also we need to go beyond it. And we don't have to make the same mistake that Luxemburg made. There are big challenges coming, the environmental questions, the questions of oppression, the questions of wages, the questions of what it will be like with a Labour government and the potential, with the dissolution with the Labour government, of the far right and the fascists, as we've seen in many parts of Europe. And therefore, the need for independent revolutionary organisation. And we can learn from Luxemburg's life the necessity of building that in advance of the struggle. Luxemburg waited till the struggle had burst out on a mass revolutionary scale. We don't have to do for that. We need to build it in advance. That's why we need to learn from Luxemburg. Build that independent revolutionary organisation. Comrades, please join the Socialist Workers' Party.